Martial arts and martial artists are amazing, but there's just one area when we're perhaps not always quite so good. And that's the tendency we can sometimes have to dislike or judge and criticize other martial arts styles and groups. It's quite a common conversation you'll hear between martial artists to criticize other styles, to say that perhaps the techniques of something else are flawed, or they'll never work on the street. So when I started thinking about this paper for this conference, I was thinking that it feels somewhat like religion and religious denominations. Both martial arts and religions can be characterized by this type of antipathy towards other groups. And on one level, that feels a bit strange, because apparently we're all seeking very similar ends. In fact, there's a very popular saying in the martial arts, which can also apply to religions, which is that we're all taking different paths up the same mountain. So I started off by looking at some of the literature around religious rivalry and hatred. My thinking was that this is a heavily researched area, so perhaps there'd be some insights there that we could pull out and apply to the martial arts. And I did find some really interesting ideas. A lot of people have written about how some religions, almost by definition, can generate resentment against other groups. And that's because the believers feel that their faith is literally the one and only truth. And that applies directly across to martial arts. The more proud a martial arts club is of its unique lineage, or perhaps it feels that its techniques are the only ones that actually work, the more likely it is to dismiss other arts. Another interesting idea I found was a debate about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation in religious practice. And again, this maps straight over to the martial arts. The dojo that's more preoccupied than anything else with how it appears to the outside world, again, may be very prone to dismissing other styles. But the idea that I felt would be really rich and promising for this line of inquiry is Nietzsche's classic take on the idea of Ressentiment and Scheler's critique of this. Now, some of you will be familiar with these ideas, and some of you perhaps not, so I'll very quickly outline the concept to you in a moment. And then I'll explain how we can use this concept to shed some light on rivalry and hatred in the martial arts. But the problem we're going to run into is that both Nietzsche and Scheler give a very, very negative account of this, very pessimistic, and they don't really propose any solutions or ways forward. And for an audience like this, the Martial Arts Studies Research Network, obviously we're all about solutions and development and productive dialogue across styles. So I'm going to share with you a contemporary take on the idea of ressentiment from Stefano Tomelleri, and discuss with you how this might give us a way forward for overcoming martial arts rivalry and hatred. Just before we move on, a couple of exclusions here. So when I'm talking about martial arts rivalry today, I'm talking about the mean, spiteful kind of rivalry. I'm not talking about healthy competition between clubs or styles. And there's another type of rivalry which is more like a kind of showmanship, and that would be when you get perhaps one of the big MMA stars mouthing off about their rival before a match to get attention and intimidate the other person. So that's not in scope today. We are talking about mean, unkind rivalry when one style dismisses another one as worthless. Also, just to be clear, I'm not going to speak about religions in general today. A 20-minute talk isn't so long, so I'm just going to refer to Christianity, because that's what Nietzsche, Scheler and Tomelleri refer to in their own writings. I'm also not going to attempt to define religion or define martial arts, as these are much longer conversations in their own right. Finally, just to let you know, I've added a slide at the end of this presentation listing all the sources that I'm going to refer to, so you'll be able to easily follow them up if anything grabs your interest. So let's start with a very high-level summary of Nietzsche's take on ressentiment. So for Nietzsche, this was a really nasty, poisonous emotion, and it was felt by what he called weak and inferior people. Nietzsche believed that these people would always be jealous of strong, powerful people. However, they wouldn't admit this jealousy. What they would do is they would actually turn the value system upside down And they would start to say that things like power and wealth and influence were actually bad things. And meanwhile, things like meekness, humility and poverty were actually morally good states of being. So in this way, a poor person could actually feel that they were morally better than a rich and powerful person, and that would soothe their bad feelings. Nietzsche called this transvaluation, or the inversion of values. And he believed that this kind of transvaluation was literally the very core principle of Christianity. So for Nietzsche, Christians were weak, spiteful people who all hated the rich and the powerful and the strong. Others have disagreed with him on this, and we'll look at that in a moment. So how does ressentiment play out in the martial arts? One example can be where you get a successful school with lots of students. Now, some successful schools are just McDojos. And if you don't know that word, it's a slang term for a martial arts school with low standards that only really cares about making money. But other schools may be popular and successful and also actually be very good at what they do. But some martial artists have this really strange blind spot that they think it's somehow morally wrong to make money from teaching martial arts. And so somebody like this might look at the successful school and they might just dismiss it out of hand as being immoral in some way. So this is ressentiment at work. Rather than feel inferior because the other school's doing better, this martial artist managed to invert the values and actually start looking down on this other school for being inferior to themselves. And further to that, they actually look at their own lack of success and small student numbers as proof of their moral superiority. So just to be clear, criticising a bad martial arts school is not ressentiment in itself. That's just criticising a bad school. But if somebody criticises another school just because it's successful and they're jealous, and then they almost pretend to themselves that they're morally superior because they have fewer students, that may well be a symptom of ressentiment at work. Another example we see a lot these days is the so-called keyboard warrior. So this might be somebody who doesn't have too many physical skills themselves in the martial arts, but they'll happily go online and they'll criticise other people's technique. So they might criticise the technique directly, but more often they'll pick on something like the way this person's used the terminology, or they'll make some ad hominem remark about the person being overweight, something like that. So again, they're applying ressentiment values and just deciding in their own head that they're superior to the other martial artist, even though this isn't necessarily true and they haven't tested it in reality. And a third example of ressentiment in the martial arts might be that perhaps you've got a teacher who's not so good at sparring and they feel embarrassed about that. So one way they can solve that problem is to just not teach sparring in their school. But they might go further. They might criticise sparring for being immoral or rough or brutal or perhaps not a good way to learn. And they might now start to look down on schools that do sparring and feeling that they're superior to it. So just to be clear, if somebody literally isn't interested in sparring and doesn't want to study it, then that's their choice and they're very much free to study whatever they want. Ressentiment arises when you've got somebody who actually wishes that they could be physically dominant, but they can't achieve it. So in order to make themselves feel okay, they start to criticise the person who is a good fighter and tell themselves that they're morally superior to that person by labelling them as a thug or some other unkind name. Okay, so that was a very quick summary of Nietzsche's take on ressentiment. Some years later, Scheler disagreed with him because he didn't think that this was all rooted in Christianity. Scheler actually believed that Christianity was a very good and loving ideology. However, he did acknowledge that people could use Christianity and pervert the values to hide their ressentiment. So you might have somebody who does resent rich and powerful people, but then they act as if they're good Christians and they pretend to love the poor and the weak as a way of masking their resentment towards the rich and the powerful. For Scheler, the real source of resentment was the way society is set up now. So he explains that when you've got a very hierarchical society, you don't tend to get the feelings of resentment because everybody knows their place and they more or less expect to stay there. And equally, if you have a truly equal society, you don't get those same bad feelings arising. But Scheler felt that the way modern society is, and he was writing this in about 1915, He felt that modern society gave the worst of both worlds. So it proclaimed equality, and the rhetoric is that anyone can achieve anything they want to, and that everything's open to everyone. But the reality is very different, and we see big differences in wealth and property, education, physicality, social status. Scheler argued that the bigger this difference between what we say about equality and then what actually happens in reality, the worse the ressentiment got. And I think it's fair to say that even 100 years later, Scheler's description of society may still hold up, where we have a story on one hand that anyone can achieve anything they put their mind to, and we have a stark reality that doesn't always match with that. So I think there are some definite implications of Scheler's way of thinking for the martial arts. Martial arts gyms and dojos can often function as a little mini society in its own right, away from the outside world. And many styles are very hierarchical. So if we follow Scheler's line of thought, the martial arts gym can form a kind of safe enclave away from the outside world, where everybody's comfortable in their place and ressentiment doesn't arise. And there's another scenario where somebody might hold a black belt and they may feel very strong and powerful and invincible inside their own martial arts club. But once they walk out the door and perhaps go back to their family or their workplace, perhaps they could feel weak or disrespected. And in the same way, they might just not have the confidence or the self-assurance to engage with people from other martial arts clubs or styles. And another point is that many martial arts are predicated on the idea that they're teaching a small or a weak person to overcome a bigger, stronger opponent. So again, the martial arts dojo could function as a protected little society where people can live out the fantasy of being stronger than they really are, but it doesn't hold up when they walk outside the doors. So in all these cases, it wouldn't necessarily be surprising if these martial artists felt some kind of ressentiment towards other martial arts clubs and styles who they suspect might be able to blow their cover. So we can see that although Nietzsche and Scheler came at this idea from quite different places, they both agreed that it was a horrible, poisonous, destructive emotion. So what's the solution? How can we move beyond it? Well, they both agreed that one of the best ways to heal ressentiment was physical fighting. They also believed that the soldier was someone who was pretty much immune to the feeling because of the work he did. So on one level, martial arts should be a place where ressentiment just can't take hold, because we're able to resolve our differences through fighting, which these philosophers are telling us is the answer. But the reality of martial arts training is quite different, and that gives us a troublesome irony or paradox. For one thing, we can't just go around fighting people from other martial arts styles. It's illegal, impractical, and it wouldn't prove anything anyway. The UFC was supposed to resolve that question by finding out the best martial art with minimal rules and no weight categories, but all it's actually done is lead to the creation of an entirely separate martial arts style, MMA. And there's even some claims now that the whole of the UFC was rigged from the start to favour and promote Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. And a lot of martial arts or combat sport training doesn't prepare us effectively to fight outside our own art anyway. Sixt Wetzler puts it beautifully. He says, as training systems for personal combat, martial arts stand in a difficult relation to reality. The extreme forms of physical violence they are supposed to prepare students for can only be simulated to a certain extent, but never acted out in reality. The result is a gap between the practice and the final goal of training. Now, ressentiment is basically grounded in a feeling of powerlessness to act. But as Wetzler goes on to explain, martial arts can't sabotage their own students' fighting spirit by allowing them to doubt the usefulness of what they're learning. So martial arts typically find ways to convince their students and outsiders of the validity of their techniques and methods. And I'm just going to float a really provocative idea here now. Is it possible that some martial artists might suspect that their own art just might not hold up in a real fight, but not want to admit that to themselves? If that's the case, this would be a perfect breeding ground for ressentiment, because that martial artist would then have to convince themselves that everything was okay by looking down and despising all other arts for not working in reality. So if we follow Nietzsche and Scheler's line of thought, we can see that martial arts can sometimes create a safe little bubble away from the rest of the world by using ressentiment values. And I'm sure this is true in some cases, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole story. Most of you watching this video are martial arts practitioners, and I'm guessing that you pride yourself on being kind, open-minded, and growth-oriented. So for people like yourself, this description of the martial arts world probably feels quite depressing and limited. Is there another way to understand martial arts through the lens of Ressentiment? This is where I'm going to introduce you to the thinking of Stefano Tomelleri. Tomelleri is an Italian academic writing in the present day, and he critiques both Nietzsche and Scheler, because in his view, the mistake they make is that they think ressentiment is an emotion felt by just certain types of inadequate people, whereas in his view, it's actually an emotion that is going to affect all of us at one time or another. Furthermore, Nietzsche and Scheler see it as something that is always negative, something that fuels fear of failure, hatred, violence, and discord. Now, Tomelleri acknowledges this, the negative side. He sees it as also having a second, more positive flip side, where it becomes so painful that it actually pushes us away from our selfish individualism and worrying about how inadequate we feel. In this way, it pushes us to choose growth and transformation and what he calls fraternity. Now, Tomelleri explains that fraternity is not the same thing as benevolence. Benevolence is something that you can almost do by yourself. You can feel kind towards other people, but you can't guarantee that they're going to take it in that way, and you can't control whether the relationship is going to be positive as a result. Fraternity, however, has to be mutual, a continuous exploration that is only constructed together with the other, and especially with the rival other, by accepting that the outcome of relationships always depends on the actions of the other person. And this is where this paper comes full circle, because Tomelleri sees this fraternity as thoroughly rooted in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So we started with Nietzsche, who blamed Christianity for the poisonous feeling of ressentiment. We then saw Scheler defending Christianity and blaming other social forces, but still for the same poisonous feeling. Finally, we've seen Tomelleri actually crediting Christianity with being the source of ressentiment as a transformative force, although he's careful to point out that he's not claiming superiority for Christianity over any other religion. Tomelleri writes of facing up to that feeling of powerlessness, which can be the source of ressentiment, and transforming it into a search for fraternity. He says, the suffering of ressentiment becomes the necessary step to the full realization that the comparison with the other is not only a source of humiliation, of rivalry, but also the space for solidarity and mutual interdependence. Ressentiment, instead of poisoning the soul, becomes the soul's salvation. Tomelleri calls for us to conduct social research in order to understand the meaning and applications of fraternity. Now, I think many of us are familiar with Ben Spatz's notion of martial arts and other kinds of technique practice as a form of research. Unfortunately, I don't have time to describe his thought in any detail today, although I've put a link at the end of this presentation. But it's a helpful principle for us to consider how martial arts might be used to understand and explore what Tomelleri calls fraternity. And what better research environment could we have than martial arts training to come face to face with our own weaknesses and limitations, working in partnership with someone else who is also vulnerable and limited? Where else can we access such a unique research environment where our partner is also our rival? And some of you will know that the Japanese word aite means the same thing, both partner and rival. Now, you'll remember that I opened this presentation with a popular metaphor that martial arts and religions are very much like people travelling different paths up the same mountain. So in other words, we're all asking the same question, we're probably going to end up in the same place eventually, we just take different routes to get there. But for Stephen Smith, this is actually a fallacy when it comes to talking about religious rivalry. It's more accurate to say that the different religions, and let's also say martial arts, are often asking very different questions. Or else, they appear to be asking the same questions, but they actually mean something completely different. So Smith argues that we're not all following different paths that converge up the same mountain. Rather, we're following divergent paths that diverge out of a bowl. Smith coins the phrase bowl climbing to denote this movement. So on that basis, Smith posits two conditions for solid interfaith dialogue. The first is that partners should agree a broad theme or topic that they're going to discuss, while acknowledging that they may well be asking different questions within that theme. Secondly, they commit to being bound by what he calls shared religious seriousness about seeking what is worthy to be sought. And I think you literally couldn't get two better principles to guide martial artists as they interact across styles. So I've worked on the assumption that if you're listening to this talk, you're very likely a martial arts practitioner who pursues a twin path of physical training and also considering relevant academic theory. I've therefore given you three concepts that you might wish to apply to your own martial arts journey, namely Ressentiment as a transformative force, practice as a form of research into fraternity, and bowl climbing as a basis for constructive inter-style dialogue. I hope you find something to use in these ideas, and if you can see a way to take them forward and you want to have a discussion, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Thank you for watching.